Did you know a toad symbolizes good fortune? It would seem even in the elder's youth he had a desire for prosperity, chasing an ever-elusive goal that, however briefly attained in the palm of your hand, is never truly enough. Was it good fortune then that the boy would meet a black bear? An unlikely friendship for sure, but nonetheless one bonded in riches and scriptures. Happiness can be sparked from a single glance. So too can desire for what others have. Over the years, the man practices his religion faithfully, but greed still looms like a shadow nested over his heart. Through his cultivation, he rises through the ranks to become an elder of the temple, living to an astounding 270 years of age. And in his lifetime, he collects over 700 Kasayas, each more brilliant than the last. But one fateful day, who should arrive but a monk astride a white horse, accompanied by his mischievous disciple, a monkey who boasted of his master's robe, the Kasaya of Ever Sparks, a gift from a Bodhisattva herself. The elder only gazed upon the Kasaya for a night, but he truly longed to keep it forever. At the behest of his two disciples, they hatched a wicked plan to set fire to where the monk was asleep, to kill for their spoils. Greed can be sparked from a single glance, and the flames of that fire can be fanned to consume everything in its wake. In despair, the elder took his own life. All his years of cultivation burned to ash in a single night. From a distance, the monkey looks upon the chaos. He had already ensured his master's safety, so why should he lift a finger to help? A monk's greed for gold should be quelled, but the elder still clung to that one Kasaya, because how else was he to show that his ties were cut? Welcome back to my deep dive story breakdown series for Black Myth Wukong. Today is all about Chapter 1. If you haven't seen my prologue breakdown video, please watch that first, as I go over a lot of the foundational concepts that will be important to understanding the story of Black Myth, especially once we start getting into the more complex themes behind the narrative. I'll link it up top and in the description box below. Now let's get into the first chapter. Page 1 of Black Cloud Red Fire, and we open on a peach. This is likely a callback to the peaches of immortality Wukong ate in Journey to the West. In the novel, the Queen Mother of the West holds a banquet every 3,000 years to celebrate when these fruits ripen. Wukong was assigned to be the protector of the peaches, but he just ends up eating them all. No peaches, no banquet, heaven was not happy. But given that peaches represent immortality and that this peach rolls away only to de-transform into our player character, the Destined One, it's rather symbolic that Wukong lives on. After dealing with the initial wolf enemies, we hear a voice say, "No matter how many times you come around, you are still as mischievous as ever." I don't know about mischievous just yet, but that was certainly one of Wukong's defining personality traits. The Destined One feels almost empty. From this voice, we learn it's not the first time we've been here. This is indicating that we are repeating a cycle. Moving on, we encounter a small shrine on the ground, and we hear the same voice once again, instructing us to pluck a hair and make an offering. As soon as we do, the barren branches erupt into bloom. I could be wrong, but these look like either peach blossoms or plum blossoms. Not to be confused with cherry blossoms, which only bloom for a few weeks. Plum blossoms in particular are one of the national flowers of China. They're distinct because they can even bloom in winter snow. So the meaning behind the flower is symbolic of resiliency in the face of adversity. It's almost suggesting no matter how many times we die to bosses and have to respawn at the shrine, we must press on. The owner of the voice then appears, and we can see it is a 土地公, a local earth deity, who calls himself the keeper of Black Wind Mountain. 土地公 are one of the lower ranked deities in the Chinese pantheon because they typically oversee a smaller community or even a single household because they're believed to inhabit the actual soil itself. If you go to Chinese restaurants, you may have noticed small shrines with fruits and other offerings placed in front or mounted on a wall. This may not always be the case, but often they are making offerings to their local 土地公in hopes that they will bring protection and good favor. The design of this 土地公is very interesting because he looks like a ginseng with his facial hair and eyebrows all being roots. The word ginseng comes from the Chinese words ren, which means person, and shen, which means plant root. This refers to how the plant's roots are forked to resemble human legs. So in Chinese culture, ren shen is actually considered a prized and sacred herb. I also think it's funny how he's carrying a bamboo back scratcher. We can also get one of these as an equipable curio later. But you see how on one end it's in the shape of a wooden hand? It's very common for elderly Chinese grandpas to use these to scratch their backs if they're not flexible enough to reach, but young people can use them too. Usually on one end is the scratcher and on the other is a roller to massage the muscles. They're pretty handy. Another thing to note is the 土地公 gets a good look at us and is almost startled to see that we look like someone. He's referring to Sun Wukong. In Journey to the West, Wukong would often consult the local 土地 to ask about various situations. So it is rather fitting that the Destined One also has a 土地公 helping him on his path. He tells us that the temple up ahead for Bodhisattva Guanyin was filled with worshippers at one time, but it was ruined by a fire, the one that happened in Journey to the West as shown in my opening narration of the ending animation. So you probably already have a good idea of what happened, but we'll expound on additional details as we progress through the chapter. A howl in the distance startles the 土地, who leaves us with these parting words. Yet another indicator that we've been on this journey before. Whether he means as Wukong or another Destined One, we'll have to see. The first Yao Guai chief or mini-boss we face in Chapter 1 is the Bull Guard. No matter how well you do, he'll eventually knock us to the ground, but before he can land a blow, the 土地 intervenes to freeze him and teach us an immobilize spell. This is exactly like Wukong's body freezing spell in Journey to the West, where he would point his finger at someone to freeze them.
来的故人，教你一招也无妨。来，速速把手伸来。
The Chinese character you see here is Ding, which can be translated to calm or settle down. It's rather interesting that this random 土地公 is helping us so much. In fact, at the end of the chapter, the narrator pointedly tells us that we never know what higher power is behind these local earth deities.
可别怠慢喽，谁知他们背后又是哪位高人？
If we read the details on his character portrait, we learn that he was approached by an old Taoist master who appeared to be mortal but had a certain air about him and bright eyes full of authority. From the context clues of this entry, we can deduce that this is likely Wukong's first master who taught him how to achieve immortality, Patriarch Bodhi. First, the portrait describes him as wearing a vestment embellished with stars and singing a song about the lofty moon. In the novel, the patriarch doesn't have a clear physical description. It more so describes his aura as awe-inspiring, but he was said to reside on a mountain in 斜月三星洞, which can be translated to the cave of a slanting moon and 3 stars. This is also a visual description for the Chinese character for the word heart, 星, which actually looks like 3 stars over a slanted crescent. This is the same xing that's in Xingyuan, which is the Buddhist concept of the monkey of the mind that Wukong represents in Journey to the West. Next, while this mysterious figure casually states that he's just passing through, he says he knows there will soon be a great upheaval in this mountain due to an old acquaintance with a bad temper, and that due to his arrogant nature, he shall find it impossible to stay out of trouble. He then instructs the 徒弟 to pass on 2 spells as a means of honoring their bond because he cannot reveal himself. In the novel, when Wukong arrives at the patriarch's abode, he is first greeted by an immortal youth. The youth tells him that the patriarch said there was going to be a cultivator outside and to go and retrieve him, so he already knew Wukong was going to arrive before he even got there. Wukong then becomes the patriarch's disciple and he learns a bunch of skills, including the 72 transformations. However, Wukong was caught showing off these transformations to his fellow disciples and causing a ruckus. This angered the patriarch, so he sent Wukong away and told him not to cause trouble and never to tell anyone that he was his master. So it makes sense that this portrait entry does not identify him either. But at the very end, a passage describes a Bodhi leaf floating down, which leads the keeper to bow until the clouds and mist obscured his sight. Huti from the patriarch's name literally translates to Bodhi, and the extended bow from the 徒弟公 was a sign of venerance to someone deserving of the utmost respect, someone like an immortal Taoist master. After beating the bull guard, we'll come to the first meditation spot. In Chinese fantasies, meditating is a way to increase your cultivation level. Usually people do it in seclusion for weeks, if not months at a time, but we don't have time for that in the real world. Because how else are you going to have the bandwidth to watch my long videos? In all seriousness, I really enjoyed these vistas because it's like a gentle reminder to practice mindfulness and appreciate tranquility. You know, to not be too upset after dying to the same boss a bazillion times. Plus, the game is very beautiful to admire. Progressing further, the 徒弟 appears again before we enter the Forest of Wolves to transform us into a golden cicada so that we can stake out the lay of the land. This, of course, is a reference to Tang Sanzang, the monk from Journey to the West, whose original identity is Jing Chanzi, which literally translates to golden cicada. He was the second disciple of the current Buddha, Ru Laifu, who is the founder of Buddhism. One day, Jing Chanzi fell asleep while listening to Buddha's sermon. As punishment, Buddha sent him back to the mortal realms to be reincarnated 10 times, and the 10th time is when he meets Sun Wukong, becomes his master, and successfully retrieves the scriptures. Now in this forest, we can encounter a blue Yao Guai with a very large head called the Wandering Wight. If you're like me, you probably died somewhere during this point, and when we die, you can see our body dissolves into a single strand of hair before fully reappearing at the 土地公's shrine. This is likely a callback to one of Wukong's special abilities called Shen Wai Shen Fa, which allows him to pluck hairs from his body and change them into whatever he wants, often copies of himself. In Journey to the West, the text explains that once someone has attained an immortal body, which Wukong had, it's no issue for them to project their form. They can be constantly transforming and adapting in limitless ways. So the hair from Wukong's body is still Wukong. It's a piece of him. Physically, he just transfigured the hairs to take on his form. In terms of what this suggests regarding who the Destined One really is, it can be open to interpretation. But I also want to add that if you finish Black Myth and start a new game, you get a new skill called the Life-Saving Strand, where you can transform a single strand of hair from the Destined One's head onto a duplicate, which then takes his place to die. Simultaneously, this skill also creates a new body for the Destined One. This to me is literally showing us that someone's true self or essence transcends physical bodies. But back to the Wandering Wight, his character design is very telling. Notice how he's bald and holding a monk's prayer beads. This would suggest he is someone of religious faith, yet he also has streaks of gold on his head, perhaps indicating an affinity for the finer things in life. And they're dripping down his head in a way that resembles trails of blood flowing down your face from a head injury. Am I making it too obvious? Also, did you guys see that video of a guy who kept dying to the Wandering Wight? Then his wife comes over and asks him if this game only has that one boss because he was stuck on it so long, that's all she saw. That was savage. Do not feel bad if you struggled with any of the game's bosses, okay? We all have different playstyles, reaction times, and learning preferences. It's not supposed to be universally easy. Additionally, unless I'm somehow missing it, this specific creature does not have a journal entry. And that's because he is a soulless golem, an imitation of a different character we'll encounter in a secret area later on in the chapter. Someone who does have a journal entry, however, is Guangzhi, and he has more backstory in this game than in the original novel. In Black Myth, Guangzhi was actually a little wolf Guai who longed to be human but was never good at it. His master, Lingxuzi, another wolf, has his friend, the black bear, transform him into a human monk. The black bear then sends him off to his friend, Elder Jinchi, who was the abbot of Guanyin Temple. Under Jinchi's guidance, he was finally able to assimilate into human life. But one day, Sun Wukong and Tang Sanzang arrived, and they had a beautiful Kasaya, which is a traditional Buddhist robe called the Kasaya of Eversparks. Elder Jinchi deeply coveted this Kasaya, and in an effort to repay his kindness, Guangzhi devised a plan to kill the monk so they could take the robe. But things did not go according to plan. The fire destroyed the temple, Jinchi took his own life, Wukong killed Lingxuzi, and the black bear was subdued by Guanyin. Guangzhi felt that he failed as a human, so he shed his monk robes and retreated to the mountains, where we, as the Destined One, now encounter him. The main deviation from the Journey to the West novel here is that Guangzhi was a human in the original. Wukong specifically states in the novel that all the monks at the monastery are human. But in Black Myth, Guangzhi is actually a Yao Guai. So we got new backstory for his connections to the other Guai in this chapter. A little more on the Kasaya. In Journey to the West, Buddha instructed Guanyin to go find a worthy pilgrim to retrieve scriptures, and gave her an embroidered Kasaya with rare jewels and knitted gold, as well as a 9-ring priestly staff to bestow upon him. The Kasaya was to protect him from falling back into the wheel of reincarnation, while the staff would protect him from meeting poison or harm. During her search, she eventually heard that Emperor Taizong was extolling virtue and selecting monks to hold a grand mass, and that the chief priest was actually the one she had been looking for. So Guanyin disguises herself as a poor monk and goes to the main city, saying she will sell the Kasaya for 5,000 taels of silver and the staff for 2,000. But for the right person, it would cost nothing. She eventually gets an audience with the emperor, who tells her that he intends to give these items to a man of great virtue. This man ends up being Tang Sanzang, so she gives the items to the emperor for free, and then they are eventually given to the monk. But back to the version of Guangzhi's story in Black Myth. As we continue playing through Black Myth, a common thread we'll see is that nothing is black and white. Almost all the characters are shades of gray. It makes you think, what does it mean to be morally good? Who is in charge of setting that spectrum from good to evil? Buddhas and immortals? Why are they the ones who get to set the standard if they themselves aren't even fully good? Speculation on my part, I feel like the devs made these changes to Guangzhi's story to add even more complexity to these questions. Because if in a black and white world, Yao are supposed to be evil, then sure, it's understandable that an evil being would suggest killing a priest to steal a Kasaya. But the reason Guangzhi came up with this plan is because he was grateful to his master and wanted to repay him, which arguably is a very human thing. But let's continue. After defeating Guangzhi, we can ring a bell in the arena. This is also a callback to the original novel when the monk and Sun Wukong first arrived at the Guanyin Temple. Tang Sanzang wanted to give thanks to the Bodhisattva for helping them so much, so he spent some time worshipping and pouring his heart out in prayer. But Wukong was a bit restless and started ringing a bell repeatedly way to amuse himself. Even when the service was over, he kept at it, and it alerted everyone in the temple. In the novel, Wukong quipped that he was just following a proverb, 做一日和尚撞一日钟, which can be translated to, if you are a monk for a day, strike the bell for a day. Such a mischief maker. So when the Destined One rings the bell, we are similarly alerting everyone to our presence. Pressing on, we at last reach the steps of the rebuilt Guanyin temple and encounter Lingxuzi, a gray wolf Guai, and he looks feral. Why is a creature like this at a temple? Clearly, there's something off. In the novel, there was a trio of Yao Guai friends, which included Lingxuzi, who was a Taoist and a gray wolf, a white-spotted snake, who was a scholar and wore white robes, and Heifeng Guai, a black bear who was a friend/student of Elder Jinchi, the abbot of Guanyin Temple. During the chaos of the fire at the temple, the black bear arrived to help because he was friends with Elder Jinchi, but he caught sight of the Tang monk's Kasaya, which Jinchi had taken. Shifting his priorities rather quickly, the black bear makes off with the robes instead of staying to help. Wukong naturally went looking for the robe and encountered the black bear bragging to his friends about the Kasaya and discussing his birthday plans for the next day. So Wukong jumps out and kills the snake first with a strike of his Ruyi Jinggu Bang right on the head, while the other two run away. Wukong chases the black bear to his abode, the Black Wind Cave, and ends up dueling him for 10 rounds, but it ends in a draw. At this point, the black bear was like, let's take a break so I can have some lunch, and then we can continue fighting. Honestly, I can't even be mad. I too prioritize food. But Sun Wukong was having none of it. He was like, how are you hungry after only fighting for half a day? Did you know I was trapped under a mountain for 500 years without even a drop of water? Also fair? But the black bear clearly didn't think so because he runs back to his cave and shuts the stone doors. While Wukong couldn't break through, he does end up intercepting a messenger bearing an invitation that the black bear had sent to Elder Jinchi. And in the letter, the black bear wrote that he assumed that Jinchi was unharmed by the fire and invited him to a celebration to behold the Kasaya he obtained. Wukong then disguises himself as the elder to gain entry into the cave, but he was found out, so the two end up fighting again. This time, the black bear gives another excuse, saying that it's way too late in the evening to fight and to come back tomorrow. The black bear turns into wind and retreats back into his cave once again. So now, Wukong was like, this is all tied to Guanyin because it's her temple. It's all her fault for allowing a black bear Guai to live so close. He goes to her home to find her, and she agrees to help him for the sake of the Tang monk. But not before chastising him for blaming everything on her, though. They return to Blackwind Mountain, and who should they happen upon but a Taoist carrying 2 magic pills. Wukong takes out his cudgel and slams it on the Taoist's head, for this was Lingxuzi, and the pills he was carrying were birthday gifts for the black bear. Wukong then comes up with a plan. He asks Guanyin to disguise herself as the Taoist, while he turns himself into one of the pills, only slightly bigger. He tells her to present the gifts to the black bear and ensure that he eats the bigger one and that he will accomplish the rest. Now this is important. When Guanyin finishes transforming into the Taoist Lingxuzi, Wukong asks her, is the Yao the Bodhisattva or is the Bodhisattva the Yao? She responds, 菩萨, 妖精, 总是一念. This can translate to Bodhisattvas and Yao are always a matter of one thought, or a single mind. This reflects the Buddhist concept that all things are ultimately products of the mind or consciousness. She also adds that when it comes to their original nature, they are fundamentally non-existent. This statement reflects a core Buddhist teaching about the nature of reality, that everyone, be they Bodhisattva or Yao, are ultimately constructs of the mind. Their true nature is empty or non-existent in the sense that they lack a permanent independent essence. This insight leads to the realization that attachment to any form, no matter how sacred or powerful, is misguided because all forms are illusory. This is also a very central theme that runs through the entire game, so keep this in mind as we continue. The disguised Guanyin and Wukong successfully gain entry to the Black Wind Cave, and Guanyin presents the elixir pill to the black bear, specifically nudging the bigger one towards him. Just as he was about to swallow it, the pill rolls down his throat, transforms back into Sun Wukong, and he begins doing physical exercises in the black bear's body. The bear falls to the ground and Wukong exits through his nose just as Guanyin turns back into her true self and throws the Jinggu on his head, which the game translates as the encaging band. She recites the mantra for the golden hoop and the black bear suffers excruciating pain on his head and finally submits. Note this is a different circlet from the one Wukong had. His was the Jinggu, which is the tightening band. Different characters, different intonation, different activation mantra. Guanyin then takes the black bear to be a guardian of her home, and Wukong finally retrieves the Kasaya and returns to his master. All of this to say, I know I went off on a long tangent, the Lingxuzi we see in the game is not the same Lingxuzi that was killed in the novel. Diving into his portrait entry, we learned that the black bear elevated this gray wolf to take on the name of his old friend and become the new master of the wolves. Unlike the real Lingxuzi who pursued immortality as a Taoist, this new wolf only cared about strength, so a lot of the wolf underlings became bitter and started to plot against him. But Lingxuzi found out, and it was the Fireblade wolf, Guangzhi, who rushed over and managed to hold him off, allowing the other wolves to flee to safety. The black bear wanted to punish the rebellious wolves, but a specific snake Guai, whom we'll meet later, mediated and peace was restored. After defeating the fake Lingxuzi, we can proceed to the Bamboo Grove Snake Trail, where we'll encounter a character whom I like to call Gourd Grandpa, or Hulu Yeye. That's not actually his real name. His real name is Yuan Shoucheng, and he was a fortune teller in Journey to the West. I'll discuss more about him in future videos because he appears in multiple chapters, but what you should know for now is he is arguably the character who set the entire Journey to the West pilgrimage into motion, so he also has a bigger part to play in Black Myth. For now, he teaches the Destined One how to master the art of spirit absorption by upgrading our Gourd. It's also really cute how his Gourd is absolutely humongous. Remember in my first video, I mentioned some artifacts only recognize one master? He flat out tells us that his Gourd already has a master, him. So this is another example of that. In any case, we can now absorb the lingering wills of spirits left behind by the formidable Yao Guais we defeat, allowing us access to certain perks and skills. There are also some other characters that briefly appear in Chapter 1. First one is the Mandrill. We see her next to a Buddha head where we can loot the skanda of form. There are 5 skandas, and these are aggregates that sum up your sense of self. In Black Myth, they're translated as form, feeling, thought, choice, and consciousness. Based on what I've read, in Buddhism, understanding the skandhas helps in realizing the truth that everything is impermanent. The idea is that none of these aggregates, either alone or in combination, constitutes a permanent, independent self. Instead, they are all transient and interdependent. Another one is Ma Tianba, who is a horse Guai and general under the Bull King. He's looking for help from other Yao Guai kings, but warns the Destined One in this chapter to not listen to the black bear. Since these characters reappear in multiple chapters, I'll talk about them in more detail in future videos when more of their story is revealed. Further along the trail, we encounter Guangmou, a snake Guai. Similar to Guangzhi, Guangmou was originally human in Journey to the West, but in Black Myth, he's been made into a Yao Guai. And diving into his portrait entry, we get some new original backstory into the character. We learn that he was always jealous of Guangzhi because no matter how hard he worked, the wolf was always more favored by Elder Jinchi. Turns out, Guangmou really wanted to embrace his Yao Guai nature instead and was angered at the abbot's hypocrisy for throwing all of his teachings out the window just because he desired a material item, the Tang monk's Kasaya. So he metaphorically and literally fanned the flames of Jinchi's greed. In the novel, it was Guangzhi who first suggested they kill the Tang monk with spears and knives, but Guangmou was like, no, that might bring disaster because the monkey is the real threat, not the human monk. So it was Guangmou who suggested setting fire to where they slept. Wukong actually figured out this plot because he overheard the monks gathering wood in the middle of the night when things should have been quiet. So he goes to heaven and asks Guangmou Tianwang, one of the 4 heavenly kings, to borrow his fire-repelling cover and promises to return it after. Guangmou Tianwang was like, what? If there's a fire, you should be getting water. But Wukong said that would only help his enemies and insisted he only cared about protecting his master. Guangmou Tianwang gives him the fireproof mantle, and Wukong uses it to cover up the Tang monk, the white horse, and their belongings. Then he casts a spell, taking a deep breath, blowing it out, causing a strong wind to arise and whip the fire into a mighty blaze. But in Black Myth, it says Guangmou is the one who summoned a gust of wind. So both he and Wukong were both trying to make the fire bigger. But back to this encounter, if you transform into Guangzhi, the Fireblade Wolf, during this fight, Guangmou relishes that you killed him. So his resentment for Guangzhi runs deep. After defeating Guangmou, we can then ring the second bell in this arena, and the Tudi Gong chimes in again.
小神有种不好的预感，钟响之后，后山传来的怨气似乎更重了一些。
This is likely referring to the resentment from Elder Jinchi. More on him later. Upon reaching the Marsh of the White Mist, we run into a peculiar monkey asking you to help your big brother and save him from a snake Guai. Once we do, he has some interesting dialogue. First, he says he has encountered many monkeys from Huaguoshan, which is where the Destined One is from and where Wukong was born. 2, he says he was banished to the mortal realm. We'll learn later that this is because of Erlangshen and Wukong, so I'll get into it more in future videos. For now, what you need to know is this monkey is one of the zodiacs. A long time ago, the Jade Emperor called a banquet, and 12 different animals raced to attend. The emperor named one year after each animal based on the order in which they arrived. The monkey came in 9th place, and this is that same monkey. Proceeding down the ramps and into the water, we encounter the Whiteclad noble, who is actually a snake Guai. As mentioned earlier, Wukong killed him in the novel, so we know this is not the original Whiteclad noble. Similar to Lingxuzi, the black bear had assigned the name of his old friend to a new snake, the one we fight here. His portrait entry details a past meeting between him and an old wolf, who is the original Lingxuzi, the same one that Wukong killed in Journey to the West. So how is he back? Turns out, in Black Myth, the black bear had learned a mantra of revival while he was a guardian of Guanyin's home, and he used this spell to bring back his dead friend. The bear shouldn't have had the power to complete such a spell himself, but he obtained a relic that could. This is referring to one of Wukong's senses. The price of this resurrection is Lingxuzi would have to drink the blood of other wolves in order to sustain his life, and he did not want to live like that. This is why the snake asks in the beginning if they should drink blood or tea. The old wolf clearly doesn't want to continue drinking the blood of his kind, so he tells the snake to tell the black bear not to see him anymore, a clear signal that he's done living his second life. The actual fight against the Whiteclad noble provides some illuminating information as well. If you die, he will say you're not the one my elder brother mentioned. If you defeat him, he will tell you that he came at his elder brother's command.
是大哥要我来此做个内应，这才假意听命于那熊皮，守着后山要道。
Who is this elder brother? In fact, several characters in the game distinctly mention an older brother. I'll give you a hint. He has 3 eyes. The Whiteclad noble also reveals that while Guanyin Temple was burned to ash, Elder Jinchi's soul remains. He also asks if we've seen the 3 bells. Our helpful Tudi Gong wonders if it's related to the temple's fire, and indeed it is. If we go to the left of this area, we can find a clearing where we can see a white wolf hanging from a tree. And sure enough, this was the original Lingxuzi. From previous context, we can safely deduce that he took his own life because he did not want to continue living if it meant surviving off of the blood of his fellow wolves, whom we see here mourning his death. Ringing the 3rd and final bell in this location reveals the hidden area. The gates of the rebuilt Guanyin Temple reopen, but we are beckoned into a version that seems frozen in time, where it still stands bereft and in disrepair. The lush greenery has been replaced with barren woods, and the ambiance is distinctly dark and ominous. Hidden areas in Black myth are manifestations of someone's obsessions, so it's not reality, but it allows us to engage with certain events. Once we enter the temple in this hidden area, we meet Elder Jinchi at last, a wretched human soul that has now warped into a Yao Guai because of his obsession, which was his greed for the Tang monk's Kasaya. At first, he is excited that a newcomer has come to bring him new treasures, signifying that even now, beyond death, greed still has a firm hold on his heart. This is similar to the novel because when he first meets the Tang monk, after an initial exchange, he asks, "Do you have anything precious to show me?" Which is kind of an odd thing to ask as an abbot. Tang Sanzang actually tries to be demure about it, but Wukong is like, "Master, what about your Kasaya? Isn't that a treasure you should show him?" The monks at the temple all snickered at this and proudly brought out 12 chests of kasayas, all made of fine silk with intricate embroidery and gold. But Wukong, the ever-arrogant one, says, "Pack them up. Look at ours." The Tang monk then tells Wukong rare items should not be exposed to covetous people, for once he sees it, he will be tempted, and once he is tempted, he will plot and scheme. Wukong insists not to worry and shakes out the robe anyway, and when Jinchi saw it, he knelt down and began to cry. Jinchi tells the monk, "Oh, my eyes are dim, I can't see well. Let me borrow it for the night so that I may look at it clearly, and I'll return it to you tomorrow." The monk is still hesitant, but again Wukong insists not to worry. When the abbot took the Kasaya back to his room, he continued to cry because he was going to have to return it to the Tang monk eventually. And that is when his two disciples, Guangzhi and Guangmou, concocted the plan to set fire to where the Tang monk was sleeping and steal the Kasaya. But as we know, Wukong foiled their plans. The next day, when the monks of the temple saw Tang Sanzang was alive and well, they were terrified that he was some sort of divine being. So they went to the abbot saying they needed to return his Kasaya quickly, but Jinchi couldn't find the rope. That's because the black bear had stolen it. Jinchi was so distressed seeing that his monastery had burned down, and he didn't have the courage to face nor solve this dilemma. So he bent forward and rammed his head into the wall, causing his brain to burst and blood to flow down his head. And we see this in his character design along with the closed eyes, both alluding to his alleged dim eyesight and the very name of Wukong's relic, eyes that sees and delights, which is translated to Craving Eyes in the English version of the game. He is also nearly identical to the Wandering Wight, except his body is gold. This is because the mantra of revival that the black bear used to bring him back requires a body. The bear's first attempt didn't work because the soul did not go into the body the bear created. That one became the Wandering Wight. Instead, Jinchi's soul ended up merging with all the precious coins that he buried in life to form this golden visage. It's even more symbolic of his greed because even in death, that's still what he cares about. This is excellent storytelling through the boss's visual design. Before the actual fight begins with Elder Jinchi, he pauses and sniffs the air.
我看不见样貌，但我能闻到那股骚味儿。莫非是你？你回来了！定是你把那袈裟藏起来了，快还给我！
Contextually, we can conclude that the you he's referring to here is Sun Wukong, so this is yet another hint for the Destined One's true identity. After defeating him, we learned that he lived for 270 years. This is because the black bear taught him some cultivation techniques while he taught the black bear scriptures. He laments that he had collected hundreds of kasayas, save for one, the Kasaya of Eversparks. And it's only in his final moments that he finally lets go of his greed, saying he doesn't want it anymore.
不！广志，广谋，那袈裟我不要了，不要了！你们别烧，都别烧了！
But it's too late, and Elder Jinchi is no more. Upon leaving the ancient temple, the hanging white wolf fades to ash as well, and we are rewarded with the fireproof mantle. It's a nice small detail that the item description even quotes what Wukong said in Journey to the West when he originally asked Guangmou Tianwang for it. But it is odd that it's here, since Wukong returned it to the Heavenly King in the novel. Perhaps someone intentionally left it here for us, but it's not explicitly explained in the game as far as I know, so we can only speculate. As we proceed through the Black Wind Cave, we finally encounter the Black Wind King, who is the black bear Guai in human form. And the first thing he says is that it's been 500 years. This sticks out to me because Wukong was trapped by Buddha under a mountain for 500 years after the first time he was wreaking havoc in heaven. So the reuse of 500 suggests to me that it's a parallel for the start of another cycle. He then goes on to reveal all the good things he's done.
我重建了观音禅院，规模比之前的更大。那些葬身火海的僧众，化为孤魂野鬼，在这黑风山间游荡。是我亲手将他们超度。 我甚至把那些经书残卷一一复原，但我知道总有一天，你还是会找上门来。
Just a tad self-aggrandizing, in my opinion, but interesting how he says he knew we would be back. During the battle, another interesting thing is, if you transform into Guangzhi, the Black Wind King says some choice words for the wolf. He'll say he asked you to guard the bells for Elder Jinchi, but that you failed and won't get to burn down the temple again. Guarding the bells is referring to the 3 bells we had to ring to open the hidden area. And if you recall, the very first bell was located in the same location where we first fought Guangzhi. During the fight, the Black Wind King also asks you, do you not want immortality? Why would he be asking the Destined One this? Unless he's actually addressing Wukong here, because in the prologue, Wukong mocks immortality and breaks himself apart into 6 relics, re-entering the cycle of reincarnation. After defeating the Black Wind King in his human form, he turns into Black Wind and whooshes away, which is exactly how he ran away from Wukong in the novel. Our friendly neighborhood Tudigong then teaches us the Cloud Step spell, which allows us to turn into mist, essentially. This is another one of Wukong's skills, called 巨形散气. This is the second skill that the mysterious Taoist figure, likely Patriarch Bodhi, instructed him to teach us. Chasing after the Black Wind King, upon reaching the summit, the first thing we see is a burning pagoda. And this should be one of the twin pagodas that actually exists in China. These stone structures in real life are about 150 feet tall, and they're decorated with carvings of Buddhist figures, including a monkey that is thought to be an early depiction of Wukong. Notice the headband? As a lot of you may know, Game Science scanned a ton of real-life structures in China and implemented them into the game. And this is just one of many examples. Now in his true form, we hear the black bear pointing out the hypocrisy of Elder Jinchi.
那家伙曾经对我说：“眼不见心不乱，寻常修为，入一切相，破一切相，方得自在。”可是他自己看到那些东西后，不也疯了吗？
In other words, seeing the Kasaya is what led to his obsession and stoked the fires of his greed. And what does that map back to? The 6 robbers I discussed in my prologue video, specifically the first one being named Eyes That Sees and Delights. So we know the first relic, the one at the very top of the pagoda, is Wukong's eyes. Here is also where the fireproof mantle comes into play. If you use it when he starts going wild with his fire, the immunity to scorch damage comes in handy. Upon defeating the black bear, he returns to his old tricks. He changes into a black wind and tries to take the treasure atop the pagoda and escape. However, the relic, as if sensing its rightful owner, like strong artifacts tend to do, refuses and forces the black bear to the ground. Upon realizing what happened, the black bear first refers to the Destined One by Wukong's title, 大圣, but then hastily corrects himself and says 小圣, young sage. We also learn he didn't know how to harness the relic, so he used it to encourage lesser Yao Guai into offerings. Again, strong artifacts can't be controlled so easily, and of course he would use it to feed into his greed to gain tribute from others. He then says he was a pawn of the celestial court and volunteers to return to Guanyin and submit to the encaging band. It's interesting that he doesn't have it on anymore. It's unclear whether it's a similar case to Wukong where it's still on him and we just can't see it, or if it was actually removed. But in any case, we now have the final piece of Chapter 1's story. Through the black bear's portrait, we learn of a conversation he had with the Long Princess and Red Boy, who becomes more relevant in Chapter 5. The Long Princess, I believe, is Long Nu, which literally translates to Dragon Girl, and she was another one of Guanyin's acolytes who had attained enlightenment at a very young age. As we know, during Journey to the West, Guanyin took the black bear to be a guardian at her home, and the game tells us that he had a tranquil life there until one day the Bodhisattva gave him a task. He was reluctant to accept the task because he felt his abilities were mediocre and that he couldn't handle something so important. The Long Princess responds, "There will be those fiercer and more ruthless than you leading the charge, and that Guanyin will attend to all," implying that this is a battle. And we do learn in later chapters that much stronger Yao Guai do indeed participate in this fight. The black bear says, "Don't try to fool me. Guanyin instructed me to practice quietly here. Why would she intervene?" And this is another thing about these portraits. Quite a few of them are so non-committal. It could be A, it could be B, or C, or D. It's not always explicit what the actual answer is, so we'll have to extrapolate for ourselves through other clues. The bear ultimately agrees to the Bodhisattva's task. And Red Boy is basically us in this situation. He asks, "What is the task?" And he says he wants to go, but the bear denies him, saying, "Even your father has been pressed into service this time." The Red Boy's father is the Bull King, who was one of Wukong's sworn brothers in Journey to the West, and a very strong Yao Guai. So from this added context, we can extrapolate that Guanyin tasked the black bear to participate in the battle against Sun Wukong, which we saw in the prologue. We know this because we learn in later chapters that the Bull King also participated in this fight, because as the journal says, he was pressed into service too. And both the black bear and the Bull King were rewarded with one of Wukong's relics for their part in the battle and in his alleged defeat. But this is the biggest indicator of all, in my opinion. The bear touches the encaging band on his head and says, "To risk one's life just to remove a headband? It's not worth it." And what did Wukong do in the prologue? Risked his life by defying heaven in order to gain his freedom. And if you watch my prologue deep dive video, you'll know Guanyin is also the one who gave the Tang monk the Jinggu, the tightening circlet around Wukong's head. And I speculated that she was the more likely character out of the two to have activated the tightening spell in the prologue, since we are told that the Tang monk had gone into hiding. In the Black Bear Guai's journal entry, it's never explicitly clear if Guanyin actually intervened during the prologue battle. But I believe Guanyin had some sort of a hand in it, if my deduction is correct, that she had assigned the bear to participate in the fight. And I think this is what the bear is alluding to when he says, "Who would dare to challenge the wrecker of the Celestial Palace?" The Tudigong agrees that the Black Bear didn't have the nerve to harm the Great Sage on his own, and that there's someone else pulling the strings. The narrator on the ending mural also reiterates that there is some bigger fish lurking behind the scenes. This isn't necessarily referring to Guanyin alone. There are definitely some other parties at play. It also doesn't necessarily mean she's evil or antagonizing Sun Wukong, because the bear said he was a pawn of the Celestial Court. As I touched on earlier, one major theme of the game is to get you to rethink what it means to be classified as a hero or a villain. Often, whoever is against the protagonist is labeled a villain, but in reality, these things are not so simple. Wukong says in the novel that Guanyin has knowledge of past and future events, which makes sense because she influenced a lot of things that happened in Journey to the West and often came to help the group. Additionally, the 81 tribulations that Tang Sanzang had to go through in the novel was preordained, were literally called the Destined One. Destiny means that something is preordained. Putting all this together, one option is Guanyin perhaps knew that the true Destined One was to arrive in 500 years at the start of this new cycle, and specifically freed the black bear Guai from his post as a guardian of her home, and tasked him to participate in the prologue battle against Sun Wukong, where she activated his tightening circlet as a cover-up so the rest of the immortals wouldn't be suspicious. Given her knowledge of the past and future, this would precisely put the bear in the right position to receive one of Wukong's relics after the battle, and she knew the Destined One would come to claim it one day. And when they arrived, she would rather the relic be in the hands of someone she trusts, so she can help ensure that the Destined One is successful in his journey to retrieve the 6 relics, just like how she helped ensure Tang Sanzang was successful in his journey to retrieve sacred scriptures. The darker option is she was angry that Wukong didn't want to be a Buddha and wanted to put him in his place. But what do you guys think her role is in Black Myth, if any? Let me know in the comments. We have now acquired the first relic, the Craving Eyes, which takes the appearance of a sacred bird with 2 eyes, the same one that Wukong transformed into in the prologue, and they shine golden just like Wukong's did. In fact, when Wukong was born from the stone, his eyes shot golden beams into heaven, which alerted the Jade Emperor to his existence in the first place. Wukong also has something called 火眼金睛, which literally translates to fiery golden eyes. He got this ability after being burned in Lord Lao's furnace for 49 days. It enables him to see really, really far away and also see through disguises. Now that we've gone through the chapter, what does this all even mean? At the surface level, we have a lesson about greed. Going back to the Buddhist concept of the 6 senses, through our craving eyes, we see things that delight us, and we can end up forming attachments or obsessions that can completely destroy us. This chains us to suffering, like how we saw with Elder Jinchi. On a deeper level though, from a more holistic perspective, the game is not just presenting a black myth in its own storyline, but also casts a darker shadow upon the original events of the novel, where many characters who were once clearly illuminated as heroes and villains are more varying shades of gray. Not even the Destined One is fully good. Did you read the portraits of the enemies you killed? No judgment if you didn't, but how many of them would you say actually deserved to die by your staff? I would say some of them deserve to be left alone. In the case of Bodhisattva Guanyin, so many monks died at her temple, but she did not intervene. If you go back to the hidden area after defeating Elder Jinchi, the courtyard is filled with their lost souls, and as far as we know, they're stuck there forever. One could argue that this was ultimately the result of human folly, and that it was necessary as one of the 81 tribulations, but conversely, it is still a tragedy that so many died. Additionally, we also have a lot of NPC dialogue indicating that this isn't the first time the Destined One has come along. It makes sense if you've beaten the game and are replaying for the characters to say, oh, you're back again. But on a first playthrough, not so much. There are a lot of comparisons between Wukong and the Destined One, suggesting they are the same, yet also not. For example, when we kill wolves, they say, the monkey has come again. When meeting Guangzhi, he says, another monkey? In Black Myth storyline, the Destined One doesn't talk, and noticeably doesn't have any semblance of a personality. As many of you know, Wukong's name is often translated to monkey awakened to emptiness. Wukong was a very animated, lively character, but the Destined One feels like a blank slate, and yet he pursues the relics with a singular focus. Why? Is it perhaps because he's operating on instinct? Because he intrinsically knows that he is not whole? But then, why make the journey so difficult? Especially as we see in Chapter 1, the relics can recognize who they belong to. The answer will become more clear as we continue through the game. In the meantime, let me know what you guys thought about Chapter 1, and if you've interpreted things in a different way, would love to know too. And don't forget, subscribe.